Welcome to Life-Changing Challengers, the podcast where passion meets purpose. I'm Brad Minus, your host, guiding you through stories of transformation and triumph, from endurance feats to overcoming adversity. Our guests defy the limits and inspire action. Ready to ignite your desire and incinerate your barriers? Join us. Your journey to the extraordinary begins now. Welcome back to another episode of Life-Changing Challengers. I'm your host, Brad Minus, and I am very honored to have Michael Herbert with me today. He's an addiction clinician and coach. He's been doing this for about 20 years and has got about 70 hours of specialized training and has actually been an addict himself. And we're going to get into his story a little bit and then talk about how he's overcome it and gone into like some great new ventures. So Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here. Yeah.
So I always start the same way. So if you could can you tell me a little bit about your childhood, how you grew up, where you grew up, what was the complement to your family, and what your childhood was like?
Okay. I was born in New Haven, Connecticut. I have two brothers, one 18 months older and one 18 months younger. And it was raised by my mother and basically a grandmother and my grandfather. So I lived in my grandparents' house with my mother and my brother. My mother and father were married for about 3 years and they got divorced. And then it was just my mother, my two brothers, and my grandparents lived upstairs. And I say that I was raised primarily by my mother and grandmother, meaning my grandfather was a postal worker, so he was gone. He was working at the post office. And my grandmother was around when my mother was working. My mother worked as a nurse. And so when she was working, my grandmother was there. My mother was young and my grandmother was old, meaning my grandmother had my mother, I think, when my grandmother was 39. So my grandmother was always an older woman and a very dominant, I would say, dominant personality. So where we were my mother's children, my mother was her mother's child. And I don't know who was in control, but I know my grandmother was harder to deal with than my mother because she was from 1900 and she was from a different world, a different way of seeing things. We were Episcopalian. And so we were raised we went to the Episcopalian church, which is probably different than other Black people in my neighborhood who went to Baptist and Pentecostal church. We're African American. We're not Caribbean American. But most of the people from our church were Caribbean. So there was some difference there. I also went to private school from first grade to sixth grade, the Episcopal private school. We were able to get scholarships there. So we went there. So there was another difference in that me and my brothers went to private school, but everybody else in my neighborhood went to the public school. So I went to a school where it was a classroom of 8, where my friends went to a school where there was a classroom of 25. So we did that until about the 6th grade, and then we went to public school. And probably one of the differences in me and some of my friends really have to do with language and speaking the English language. I spoke it differently than my peers, so I sounded different, and on some level you get teased for sounding different. So those were some of the differences in the school that I went to, the church that I went to. I think as a child, I felt some insecurity about not having a father. My mother and father must have gotten divorced when I was about 3 years old. So I have no recollection of my father being in the house. I didn't formally meet my father until I think I met him around 12 years old. So it was really, even though my grandmother was, she was so rigid and it was one way to do things. I got to tell you, without her in my life for that foundation, I don't know where I would be now. So as much as it was difficult, I really applaud her and I'm grateful that she was there really to pick up the slack and provide me, I don't know, the discipline. And, sometimes the rigidity, the black and white thinking that I have now, sometimes that can be problematic, but it has kept me on some level out of trouble or less trouble than I could have been in. It was that kind of discipline that was helpful. So I went to private school. And again, I pick up on language. I pick up on visual cues, but I'm not a good student. I'm not a good a reader. I didn't remember things well. I didn't pay attention often in class. I was a daydreamer. So I didn't do very well in grade school. I did just enough to pass. Same thing in junior high school and same thing in high school. I did just enough to pass. I was probably labeled back then a slow learner. That's what they called people. Well, he's a slow learner. But when I had a different learning style, I realize that now, if they taught in the way that was conducive to my style, I would have been further along educationally than I had got. But I have no insecurity or no bad feeling about not having a college degree. I actually feel good that, wow, I have created so much success with a high school diploma. It's unbelievable. I've supervised doctors, MDs. I've been the boss, so to speak, of master's level clinicians, bachelor's level, and been the director and their supervisors. So it hasn't really hindered me to not have the degree that other people have. When I left high school, I had the choice of, Michael, either you're going to go to college or you're going to get a job. Neither one of them I was interested in. And so I naively joined the Navy. And I just figured there's no war going on, so we're probably not going to do anything. I'll just hang around the Navy for 4 years. Well, little did I know, after boot camp, they pretend like it's war. And I was stationed in Puerto Rico for 2 years, and then I was on an aircraft carrier for 2 years, and we worked every day. So it was a tough environment. And that's probably when I got into drugs, alcohol, and started to experience what addiction was, although it wasn't something that I realized that I had. I didn't realize I was an addict back then. I just thought I was having a good time. Yeah. So that's a little bit about how I started in life. Any other questions about my early life or anything I left out?
Absolutely. And this is going to, obviously, for those of you watching on YouTube, this is going to probably end up being mostly audio. I just unfortunately got some technical difficulties with my camera. I have no idea why. Anyway, but we'll continue on. First of all, so you went into the United States Navy. So thank you for your service. I'm also a veteran, 9.5 years in the Army, just so you know. And so the first thing I'm going to ask is, what was your job in the Navy?
My job, I was an ABA, aviation boatswain's mate handler. And when I first finished A school, I wound up in Puerto Rico. And so the job in Puerto Rico was crash and rescue. So I worked on the airfield and basically waited for planes to crash, which they never did. And so
Thank God for that.
Thank God for that. But it was kind of like you're sitting in a fire truck or you're sitting in a tower for 8 hours a day, just waiting for things to happen. So there was a little excitement when some planes landed and there were some problems, a few engine fires and things like that, but I never experienced a crash or anything like that. So I was there in Puerto Rico. You couldn't have found a better place to be in the military. I moved off base. I had a couple of roommates and we rented a house and lived there. This was the disco era. The other thing about the military is, at least how my experience was, it's where you learn to drink. It's a rite of passage to learn to drink, and everybody has to learn to drink, and you have to get along and drink. I didn't like drinking. I thought, I looked at people who drank as bums and losers. I was more interested in drugs. So I smoked more marijuana in those early days, and then was introduced to cocaine when I was in Puerto Rico. It was the disco era. We used to go to this disco. The manager would sell it to us, and I would buy cocaine. So I spent a reasonable amount of money on cocaine, but it didn't really matter because I was in the military and they fed me and they gave me clothes to wear. So I didn't experience any of it wasn't a financial burden for me to just spend my money on it. When, as I'm telling the story, I don't want to come across, here's this guy in the military and all he's doing is drugs. Listen, I think I knew better, but I realized over time that I have this condition that leads me to continuing to doing something that's working against me. I can't control the fact that I have this reaction to alcohol and drugs. It's just like a diabetic can't control the fact that they have a reaction to sugar. And I have this reaction to drugs and alcohol that really took over, and my brain was in control and wanted more. And I did what I needed to do to get more. The progression happened for me over time. So yeah, I could put it down and show up for work. But as time went on, it became harder and harder to put it down and go to work. And the drug became the priority, where initially work was the priority, so I can work so I can buy drugs. And then it switched itself over time where the priority was using, and it wasn't work. And that's where the real dilemma came in, because now I can't afford to do the thing that I have become addicted to do. So I got out of the military and I had the smarts to realize that even though they offered me a re-enlistment bonus, there were too many guys who had gotten busted for drugs who wound up in Leavenworth. Ooh. And I didn't want to wind up in federal prison. So in my mind, I knew that I was going to do drugs and wasn't going to be able to stop. I didn't understand that to be addiction. I just knew, Michael, don't stay in this military because you're going to wind up in prison. And so why don't you just get out? So I got out, and luckily, because I was in the military, I got 10 points for the test for the post office. So I took the test for the post office and got a job with the U.S. Post Office. So I got a job in Bridgeport, Connecticut with the post office. And that's about the time when I switched from sniffing cocaine to smoking crack. But prior to that, when I was in San Diego on the aircraft carrier, I met these people. As an addict, you're always meeting other addicts for some reason. They just show up. And they used to have these parties. So this guy said, oh, we have these parties where you want to come. You just got to bring $100. And I said, okay, sure. So I'd get to the house, and it was me, that guy, and another guy. And I said, what kind of party is this? And what it was freebase. So everybody brought the $100. We got $300 worth of cocaine. They cooked it up and we smoked it. And I liked that idea because this is when Richard Pryor was smoking cocaine. Everybody in Hollywood was doing it. And I felt like I was some big shot. I'm some Hollywood somebody who's now smoking cocaine. I was a Hollywood nobody. And so I started smoking cocaine and I loved it. But every time the ship would go out, we would go out for so long, it would just completely get out of my system. So I didn't understand that I was addicted to it, because you'd smoke for a weekend and then the ship would go out for 30 days or 80 days or whatever. And we would come back in. And every time we came back in, I would find these guys and go to these parties. Eventually, like I told you, I got out of the military. I eventually got a job at the post office in Bridgeport. And literally my first day at the job, I was working 11 to 7 and I was smoking cocaine and I couldn't get myself out of the chair to get to work. So I was about an hour and a half late my first day of work. I
Oh my
made a big
God.
excuse because I had to drive an hour to get there, and they seemed to understand, blah, 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 and got away with it. So I had this job. I had this drug problem. Probably 9 months, a year into the job, I went to the EAP. I need some help. He said, we can get you in a rehab. He said, it's a $500 deductible. I said, you got to be kidding. I'm not going to pay $500 to go to a rehab. Find me a rehab that's free. And he said, you can go to the VA. And
Hmm.
so I decided to go to the VA hospital. And that was in 1985. And in 1985, they had a policy at the VA hospital in West Haven as we trust our veterans. So that meant they didn't take urine, which meant for me as an addict that I got high the whole 90 days I was in treatment. And every
Oh,
time they asked
geez.
me if I was getting high, I'd just tell them no. And they had to believe me because of their policy. And what it was on the weekends, they would let you go home or do whatever you wanted on the weekend. You get weekend passes. So every weekend I would get high, or at the end of the day when I can get away, I would get high. I did that. I got back to the post office, started working again. The addiction just got worse and worse. And I came up with the bright idea, and I realized why I had addiction problem. I said, oh, I know why I have this problem. I make too much money.
Oh, geez.
So
That's interesting. That's an interesting dilemma to have, right?
yeah, I was making $27,000 or $28,000 a year. That was in 1985. I make too much money. So here's how I'll resolve this. I'll quit the job. So I quit my job at the post office and then realized I had a drug problem. How am I going to get drugs? I don't have a job. This is how crazy my thinking was. Eventually, I got a job as a janitor at the Hartford Civic Center. The Hartford Civic Center was owned by Aetna Insurance Company. So your insurance benefits started the day you got the job. Within a very short period of time, working at the Civic Center, I just couldn't maintain the job and live because I was spending all of my money on getting high. And it got to a point where they had a Wendy's at the Civic Center and they would keep the bread behind a cage. And I was about 158 pounds then. I mean, I'm 6'2". 158 pounds was really thin. And I would always spend my money on getting high and never would eat. Every time I was getting high, as soon as I get some money, I'm gonna get something to eat. Every time I got money, I went back to get high. So I would go to the Wendy's and I would pull bread through the fence. So the bread would all get all ripped up and but it was the only thing that I had to eat. I was reduced to squeezing bread through a fence. I had been on the occasion, I would go on the garbage of some of the shops that I would clean. If they had what I would consider good garbage or something to eat that didn't look like it was too bad, I would eat it. And just, I got to a place in my life where I don't know that I was an animal, but I was just a desperate individual, desperate to survive. I was not a violent addict. I didn't rob or steal from people. I robbed and stole from myself. And that was just, I had gone from, at least personality wise, this spoken, good looking guy who at least pretended like they were doing well, could put up that front, to literally a bum. I remember one day walking down the street and I had this white hoodie on and I passed the store and I could see my reflection. And I looked at how dirty I was. I looked on how skinny I was and I was horrified. And I knew I needed to get some help. So luckily, like I told you, the Hartford Civic Center was owned by Aetna. So I did have insurance. So I got my insurance card. I called up the insurance company. They found a rehab, and I was able to get myself into a 30-day rehab upstate New York. It was called Conifer Park. And it was a relief that, wow, the bed was clean. They fed us. It was inspiring to be there. I met people there. I could talk to people. I learned stuff about myself. I learned stuff about me having a disease, that I wasn't like some failure or loser. But once the substance got into my system, I could not predict the outcome. It really helped me, but it was a 30-day program. And if it was up to me, I would have extended, but they don't give you extensions there. So they asked me, they said, Michael, you have an opportunity. We can send you to a long-term treatment program where you can go back to work. I will get you in a halfway house and an outpatient program. I said, there's no question of where I'm going. I'm going long-term because there's no way I'm going back to some dead-end job being a janitor for the Hartford Civic Center. And so let me see what I can do with this long-term program and see if they can help. They sent me to a long-term program, which was called the Therapeutic Community. And I got to tell you, it was a nightmare. It was nothing like the 30-day program I was in. Everybody in that program, except for 3 other people, were from the Department of Correction. And I would say the majority of them were there to beat being out of jail. They didn't necessarily want to be there. I wanted to be there, but my peers didn't seem to want to be there. And the staff were what we used to call back then textbook junk, which are counselors that went to school for addiction or counseling, but really they weren't addicts themselves. They didn't really deeply understand what addiction was. So their approach, it didn't serve me. The other program had a mixture of people that on the staff that were in recovery and weren't, but they understood addiction. This place was more a behavioral modification place. And it was really tough for me. It wasn't tough for me like I couldn't get through it, but it was like, really? You got to be kidding. I'm listening to these counselors that didn't seem to know more than I knew. I felt like I knew more. And they were, my opinion, they were shaming, and they were really ill-equipped for what they were doing. But I didn't have anywhere to go. And I often would say, screw this, I'm out of here, I'm leaving. And I'd get to the door and I'd say, well, where am I going to go? So I'd march myself right back in, and I wasn't going anywhere. But the 30-day program that I was in, what they recommended when I went to the long-term program, along with going to the long-term program, engage in a 12-step fellowship. So they were not open to a 12-step fellowship, this other place, but they had to comply with it because that was the continuing care recommendation. So they told me I could go, but if I wanted to go, I'd have to walk. So I would go 3 days a week and I'd do 4 or 5 miles to these meetings. And over time, I would get to know people who would pick me up and drop me off. And so that was my first exposure to a 12-step fellowship. So I completed the program after 7 months. What I realized that the program offered me, which I didn't realize when I was in it, was humility. Because I was an arrogant, grandiose, thought I knew better than everybody else, wanted to argue everything, was always right about everything. And that program offered me some humility, some much needed humility. I completed the program. I, over time, felt grateful for what I went through because I didn't need any more education about addiction. What I needed was education about recovery. And that's what I got from the 12-step fellowship that I engaged in. I got a job telemarketing, which I love because I have a great voice and people would like to hear me on the phone selling these products to them. And they would always tell me how good I sounded on the phone. I used to sell this stuff called Omexin, which is this oil that men would rub in their hair, balding men, and it was pig fat. And it was one of those infomercials that would come on TV.
Right.
And people would buy it. I don't think it worked. We also used to do this cream for women called Anushka, which was for cellulite. We also sold the Great Walk of China and the V-slicer that slices and dices vegetables and things like that.
Yeah.
So that was my first job. And I got to tell you, I loved it. I loved talking to people. I wound up talking to a lot of celebrities. I don't know if you remember Starsky and Hutch. There was a
Yep.
character called Huggy Bear on there. And I talked to his mother on the phone about, I think it was the Great Walk of China or the V Slasher. I can't remember
Right.
which it was. So it was great to do that. But I had gotten about 2 years in recovery, and I got a letter from the 30-day program. And they said, we have an internship program if you're interested in it. It's a 13-month internship program. We'll teach you about addiction and recovery process and helping people with addiction. So I said, absolutely, I'd love to be in the internship program. So I quit my job and I moved upstate New York, and I got involved in this internship program, which was 13 months. And it was 7 hours on the unit and 2 hours every morning classroom. And so I did that. And halfway through it, they said, we're running out of money. We're not going to be able to do the 13 months. But what we can do is jam all the education into 9 months. And so if you guys are up for it, we can get this done in 9 months. So I completed the internship program over 9 months. And I think I got 500 hours worth of education in that 9 months. And then, I don't know, 2,000 hours of paid work of work experience, because I also got a part-time job on the adolescent unit. And I needed those hours of education and the hours of work experience to sit for the exam in the state of New York. But I was minus a few hours. So when I completed the internship, I got a job at a therapeutic community called Samaritan Village in Manhattan and completed the work experience hours. I submitted them to the state of New York. I got certified as an addiction counselor in the state of New York. I kept that job at the therapeutic community for a year, and then I switched to an intensive outpatient program. I was the first person they hired. They opened up, it was called Intercare LTD. And I can remember the first client I had was a lawyer who had an addiction problem to cocaine. And we did an intensive outpatient program, which was 3 days a week, 3 hours a day with an individual. And I sat with this one guy for 3 hours, 3 days a week with one individual. For 7 hours a week, I was with this one guy until we got our second and third, fourth, and fifth patient. So for the first 2.5, 3 weeks, I was with this guy like 7 hours a week. On some level, it was torture to sit with one person that long, but it gave me an opportunity to learn a little bit about myself, learn about patience, learn about tolerance, develop some skill, practice some lectures with this guy, and also work on some insecurities, because now I'm the counselor for a lawyer. Boy, the lawyer should be counseling me on some level. And working at Intercare was great for me because I eventually did work for the Lawyers Assistance Program. So I worked with all the impaired attorneys. I worked with the impaired physicians. Back in the 90s, there were soap operas. So I worked with all the people from One Life to Live and all my children who had
Wow.
addiction problems. So it was fun because you would see them on TV, and then they'd be in their office, be in your office. So there was a lot of things that I learned because I was working with a group of people who, on some level, I wasn't a part of that group. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an actor. I don't know. I was just some regular guy with a high school diploma. Most people over time would call me doctor because they assumed I was a doctor because of the way that I sounded. But I would always correct. I said, I'm not a doctor. I'm a certified addiction counselor. So I started to develop a level of pride around my ability to be successful without the degree, which
Yeah.
really just talks about who I am as a person. And one breath you can say, oh, Michael, you're a special person. But in another breath, I'm not that special. I just have a skill set that works for the work that I do. I have a personality and a way of being that fits in that. You couldn't get me to do accounting. I'd never be an astronaut, but I can certainly be a counselor and a coach and do really well at it. So I did that for a while. Eventually, I left Intercare. I was there for 7 or 8 years. I moved out to Texas for a year. and then got recruited into a job here in Florida and worked for them for 14 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
with them, I was a counselor. I also did family counseling, and then I became the clinical director of their high-end program. Those are for individuals with high net worth and value. But in between that, year 7, I left that job and packed up my things, sold my house, sold my car, and I moved to Egypt. And I became an addiction counselor working with individuals and families in Egypt. And I started a 12-step fellowship, the only 12-step fellowship that was in English in Egypt.
Yes, that was my question. I was going to ask you about the language. You just decided to get up and move to Egypt, and then all of a sudden, and I was like, "How do you learn Farsi or Arabic while you're out there?" That fast
Well, you know what?
Egyptian.
There were a lot of expats that there. So
Okay.
there was one 12-step fellowship there already, but I wasn't a part of that. That wasn't my thing. But I wanted to bring the one that I was in there. They already had it, but it was all in Arabic. And so I would go to the Arabic meetings, and they would always have me speak because back then I had 16 years, and they didn't know anybody with more than a year. And so I was a big shot out there sharing my story, but I still couldn't fully engage in the process because I didn't speak Arabic. So there were a lot of Egyptians who did speak English. So I developed relationships, friendships with them around recovery. But the bigger part was this one meeting. So I stayed in Egypt for about a year. I came back to the job and was back at the job for another 6 or 7 years. And then that relationship ended with me in that job, and I started a private practice. So in about 2013, I started a private practice. I think in 2011, I went to the University of Miami and took their year-long course in professional coaching. So I did that certification course, professional coaching. I was an addiction counselor. I got certified in intervention. And then I got another certification in what they call structured family recovery, where I work with individuals and their families for over a year. And everyone in the process gets in the recovery process, not just the person with the addiction problem. So mom, dad, sister, brother, wife, husband, all have to engage in their own personal recovery in order to be a part of these sessions. So I work with about 6 to 8 families per week doing that. And so that's what I've been doing. Throughout the time, I have engaged in my own personal recovery. So my personal recovery means that I go to meetings, I have a sponsor, I've helped other people in recovery, I've gone to retreat that are non-12-step based. Some are 12-step based. One of them that I went to was a place called Onsite. I did a week there. I also did this place called the Hoffman Institute in California. And I got to tell you, that place was life-changing. It was just a great experience. Throughout my recovery, for me, if recovery for me was going to the meetings and reading their literature, I would have gotten out of that a long time ago. It would have just been too boring for me. But for recovery for me was, how do you get your life together, get clean, get into recovery, and start living your life? My life prior to getting into recovery was daydreaming. I would daydream about stuff. I had this job in Intercare in New York, and I was reading a GQ magazine, and this guy went to this primitive living course and lived in the desert in Utah, and the only goal was food, water, and shelter. And I read that, and I just got into big daydream about that. And I was talking to my boss, and I said, "Hey, Bob, look at this guy. He went to the desert, and he did this, that, and the other." He says, "Oh, it sounds pretty neat. Why don't you do it?" And I said, "I don't know. I never thought about doing it." So I found the phone number there, and I did my first primitive living course.
Hmm.
And it was living in the desert of Utah. The only goal was food, water, and shelter. And how do you survive out there? And then a year later, I did another one, and I went to the mountains of Mexico and stayed with the Tarahumara Indians. And those are the
Yes.
Mexican Indians that run barefoot.
Oh my God. You totally just segued into my life. You just totally segued right into where I am because I'm an endurance coach. So when you
Oh,
talk
you got to
about
be kidding.
the Tiramahua Indians and their ability to run hundreds of
Uh,
miles a week
yeah.
on barefoot,
Mhm.
yeah, you're talking about so you were in Gold Canyon,
Yeah. Yeah. I was in, I don't know, I went to Chihuahua, Mexico. That's where I
yeah.
flew into. And then I went up in the mountains and yeah. And I stayed with them. It was a great experience. But I got to tell you, I had to sleep on a cave floor and I've never slept on anything so hard in my life. It was hard and it was cold, but it was great. And so those are the things that I went to Cuba in the early 90s. You weren't supposed to go there, but I went there anyway because I like to travel and I like adventure. So that was adventure for me. In my recovery, I've been on 4 different safaris. I've gone gorilla trekking. 2 years ago, I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. About 10 years ago, I ran an ultra marathon, 155 miles through the Sahara Desert. It was a marathon a day for 4 days and 58 miles on the 5th day.
Gee.
I climbed an active volcano last year. And when I was a kid, I would watch the National Geographics. I would watch all these nature shows and I would see all of this stuff that I wanted to do. Listen, I've been to the big city before and I know what a nice hotel is like. Have you ever been brushed up against by a gorilla?
Yes. No,
Last year,
I would
I,
like to know what that feels like.
yeah, I fed wild hyenas in Harara in Ethiopia.
Wow.
And this is what my recovery is about. I did CrossFit for about, I don't know, 14 years. I work out regularly. I run. I meditate 3 times a day. Food is difficult for me to stay on a healthy diet. I've tried vegan, I've tried vegetarian, I've tried this, that, and the other. Food is a tough one for me, but in my recovery, I've always been in shape, but there was one point that I got really heavy and I got up to about 285 pounds. And I said, boy, this is way too close to 300. I lost 100 pounds and
Wow.
got myself down to 180, 192. And I've been that way now for the past 5 years. So, recovery for me is about an adventure. It's more than just going to the meetings. I'm a beekeeper. I have 100, 200,000 bees in my backyard. I'd stay fit. And I think what my true goal in life is to help others. And I've done it professionally and I've gotten paid for it. And it doesn't feel like work because it seems like it's something that comes natural to me. It's something that I really want to do. But over the past couple of years, I've gotten to a place where I want to do this, but I want to do it in a different way. That, showing up to my office, scheduling appointment, and kind of marketing myself as this coach to help people, I don't know, just isn't working for me anymore. I want to do something different. And I was in Ethiopia last July, and I was waiting for a group to come tour with me, and they didn't show up. So it was just going to be me and my tour guide. So we waited in this village in the Afar region of Ethiopia, which is the hottest place on earth, the Afar region. And the head of the village took me on a tour of the village. We saw his school, which was a tent school. And he said it had gotten blown over by a dust storm and everything was lost. I said, oh, wow. Maybe when I come back to Ethiopia, I'll bring you some school supplies. So this was in July of 2023. And I got to tell you, in September, I was thinking, I want to go back to Ethiopia. Looked at my pictures. I got to get back to Ethiopia. And I said, oh boy, if I go back to Ethiopia, then I got to get this guy a bunch of stuff. I told him I was going to get him school supplies. As if he wouldn't know if I was ever back in Ethiopia. He wouldn't know it. But I'm feeling like, oh God, I
Yeah.
told him I would do it. So now I got to do it. In October, I said, let me do a fundraiser. I'm going to raise $1,800 and get them some school supplies. So I put it out there. And within about 3 hours, I had raised $3,000.
Oh, fantastic.
I got to tell you, within a week, I raised $13,000. And I
Jeez.
said, boy, I can't bring $13,000 worth of school supplies. So I applied for a 501c. And miraculously, in 2 weeks, I got approval from the IRS. And within a month of my original fundraising, I had raised $30,000. So I have a 501c now. I've got a board of directors. I've been able to provide educational material for 3 different schools, 300 kids, and each one of them has notebooks, pens, papers, maps, rulers, solar calculators to last them for a full year. I've also I haven't rebuilt the school, but fixed the walls in one school and fixed the cement foundation in that school also. And I have 2 other classrooms that I'm going to do, and then figure out a way to help these other kids. There's one kid that I met, 19 years old. Oh, can I draw you a picture? He drew my picture, did a beautiful picture of me, sent it to me. So this is a kid that I want to help personally through the 501c and through me personally to help him with his art studies. So I'm going back to Ethiopia in May or June of this year. And last year, when I went, I bought 7 suitcases, just me, 7 huge suitcases of stuff. You should have seen me going through these airports with this stuff.
Oh my God. Yeah, I can't even imagine.
But it was great to be able to do it. I'm fortunate enough that I have a client that barters with me and gets my airfare taken out. So I don't have to use money that I raise to get to Ethiopia. And so the majority of the money that I raise goes directly to the people. There's some administrative costs that need to be taken.
Right.
But other than that, and I got to tell you, these people were born in Ethiopia through no fault of their own. They just happened to be born there, just like I happened to be born where I am.
Right.
And they have nothing. Peter Glenn, the ski shop, gave me about 150 T-shirts, and I gave them to all of the kids. And these are kids who have never owned one piece of new clothing in their life.
It's just got to be an amazing feeling to be able to do that for people.
When I think about it, the hair on my arms start to stand up. I just get tingly. I feel emotional when I think about the way that these kids looked at me, and they were so grateful and I would look at them and they were filthy dirty. Their clothes were, you could see that somebody had sewn their shirt together and their pants together, and they were playing soccer barefoot, not because they chose to be barefoot, because they don't have any shoes. And one of the examples I'll tell you about a kid there, right? So this one kid, his father and his grandfather, his children and his grandchildren, in their lifetime, may never experience a glass of ice water. That's how poor they are. That's how hot it is there. That's how their situation is in life. They don't have anything, things that I take for granted. Listen, I have 3 TVs in my house. I can only watch one. What am I doing with 3 TVs? And these people have nothing. So it reignites that part of me that wants to help, that I have the ability to help. And when I see that there's a problem, when I see that there's something that needs to be corrected, and this situation needs to be corrected, I need to respond to it. Like, I've been to Africa before, and you give somebody $5 or $20 here, you give them a T-shirt, you give them some soap, that's not going to do anything to change their life. That may make them feel good for a minute. But my mission is really to help change somebody's life. I've been able to facilitate and support life-changing experiences with people with addiction problems. And I'm glad that I've been able to help people. Listen, I haven't been the cure-all for them, but I have been able to help. And that gives me a good feeling. But I really need to, Brad, get to the next level. And the next level is, I feel like doing this work and helping these kids. I specifically want to help kids in remote areas of Africa. I want to go to the places where these kids have been forgotten or there's very little for them. So I'm not going to Johannesburg or Nairobi, a big city,
Right.
and doing all that stuff. Listen, I don't have Oprah money to create a school for these kids, but I got what I got, and I'm going to offer what I have to help them, and they will be helped.
You're a gift. You are definitely a gift. I don't want to derail you because I think this is like super important to what you're doing. And I'm grateful that I was able to share that with you. My question, I just have a couple of extra questions. So I want to wrap this up a little bit. One is I want to go back to the Terahuma real quick, just because I'm an endurance guy. Is that what got you started in marathon running? Was being with the Terahuma, or did you start before that?
I started running. I would do these 5Ks and 10Ks. And then a lady just asked me, she said, Michael, do you want to run an ultra marathon? I said, sure. And I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't think I could do it, but I just said yes. When I got to Egypt to run that ultra marathon, I didn't think I could do it. The first day out there, my feet swelled so bad. After 18 miles, I couldn't wear my sneakers anymore. So I did 137 miles in Tivas. The Tara Mahara would make these sandals out of tires.
Right.
So I had my Tivas. So I did 137 miles in Tivas. And,
wow.
And I got to the last 15 miles. And I said, you know what? I feel like quitting. Let me just quit. Listen, I did 135 miles. I'll tell people I did 135 miles. And I'm just going to quit because it was just exhausting. And lo and behold, a woman comes, a nurse from Jacksonville, Florida, comes running next to me. And I look down at her and she has just socks on. So she had been running in just socks because her feet gave out, her shoes gave out. So I said, if she can run in socks, I can run these last 15 miles. So 187 or 183 people started with us. 117 finished. I was 114 out of 117, but I beat the youngest guy who was 19 from Korea. So that was listen.
That's great.
Listen, I was 6'2", 240 pounds. I was the heaviest guy out there, probably the tallest guy too. I'm not built for running, but I was able to complete that race. And I also raised $100,000 for a scholarship fund for addiction treatment. So it really worked out for me. Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah. So let me wrap up with just two more questions. One is, as far as recovery goes, and it seems, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like your resource, I would say, that you use, the tool that tend to keep you on the path to recovery was adventure, making changes, going after things that you felt a connection with.
But the foundation was the 12-step program.
Okay.
So I couldn't have done it without I couldn't have done it without being able to come back to something. And listen, Asia, Africa, Europe, everywhere I've gone to 12-step meetings while I was there. So even in my adventure, part of that adventure was I'm going to find a meeting to go to. And the nice thing about going to meetings in foreign countries is they always take you somewhere where tourists never go that you would never be able to find out. So that other people in those foreign countries who are in really treat you to some special places in their country. So it really does work out. Yeah.
So number one, so if somebody's looking to get into recovery, they've gotten to that point that you had gotten to while you were in the Navy and before you decided to go to the 30-day program, would you say that get yourself into that 12-step program and finish the 12 steps?
No, I wouldn't say that, because oftentimes you need coaching or counseling along with you, because you can go to these 12-step meetings and get totally turned off by something you hear, overwhelmed with what they're doing, or not really understand it. So if you can get a guide to help you with, because most 12 steps, if you look at statistics, and they do this, people don't come into a 12-step meeting off the street. They usually are coming from rehab, therapy, or jail. And they learn about it through rehab, therapy, or jail. And that's what gives them a little bit of a head start versus the guy who just comes in off the street. The guy that comes in off the street doesn't know what's going on. But if you're coming from a rehab or therapy or coaching, at least the coach, the counselor, the rehab can give you some information. And when you have a curious about something in the 12-step fellowship, you can go back to that counselor and say, what is this? Or why are they doing this? Or I don't like this or that. And you have somebody to process it with. If I didn't like the 12-step fellowship, I probably wouldn't complain to somebody who liked it. So I could go back to my therapist or I can go back to my counselor and say, I thought this was weird, or that therapist or coach gives me the space to talk about something maybe I'm not ready to talk about in that fellowship. So I think the keys to recovery are individual counseling or group counseling, 12 steps, diet, exercise, some kind of spiritual component, medication if you need it, family involvement. I think those are if you can get a little bit of all of those things, it's going to set you up for recovery. And obviously, a job, if you're unemployed, would help too. But it's all of those things, not just one of those things.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So rehab, 12 steps, diet and exercise, spirituality, family, a job, and then what seems to me what worked for you, I'm not saying that works for everybody, is finding that passion.
Finding your
something
passion
that ignites you.
Whether it's you want to go back to school, you want to travel, you want to learn something new. Listen, I tried beekeeping. Listen, beekeeping is okay. It's not my real passion, but I got these bees in the backyard and I get honey out of it. So it's great. But the travel is real. And I know people who have started businesses and moved out of this idea of working for somebody and working for themselves because now that they've developed the confidence and they're able to take a risk in doing things. When I moved to Egypt, that was a huge risk for me. I left my job. I was making $150,000 a year. I left a job and just moved to Egypt. And guess what? I got through Egypt. I was successful there. I had a great time. And when I came back, the same job offered me $7,000 more to come back.
Oh, there you go.
And I gave my dogs away, and the guy who got my dogs gave me my dogs back.
Oh, that's awesome. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So I got everything back. Yeah.
Excellent. Michael, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I really appreciate it. Michael has a website, and it's coachmichaelherbert.com, and what is it?
recoveryguide.net.
recoveryguide.net.
And I have an email, michael@africanhopefulhorizons.org. And my not-for-profit is africanhopefulhorizons.com. And I can be reached email at recoveryguide@gmail.com. So africanhopefulhorizons.org is my email, or recoveryguide@gmail.com is my email. Yeah.
All right. And I'm going to link all that in the show notes for you. But
okay, great.
But yeah, everything's going to be in the show notes. The roadmap we just went over, that will be in there as well. So listen, again, it's been a real honor, Michael, and I hope to talk with you again. And I totally wish you as much success on the African Hopefuls. Say it one more time, please. African Hopeful Horizons. Yes. Mm-hmm. And yes. And I wish you all the best luck, because I think that is something that is very important for us nowadays, and to make awareness of that, which is the reason why we're going to make sure that's blasted on our notes and on the notes for this episode and on social media.
All right. So, great, Brad. I really appreciate you taking the time with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk to you next time on Life Changing Challengers. Thank you.
Great. All right. Bye.
Well, that wraps up another episode of Life-Changing Challengers. I'm your host, Brad Minus, saying thank you for joining us on this journey of transformation. If today's stories inspired you, please take a moment to review, share, and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps us reach more listeners and create an even bigger impact. Remember, every challenge is a chance to grow. Until next time, keep pushing, keep challenging, and never stop pursuing your extraordinary.